County. Webster County. This is the last call for 9426. Chaplain Henderson answered his final call October 2nd, 2019, and has completed his mission here. He passionately served his community with kindness, generosity, and faith. Your brothers and sisters in public safety will forever be grateful for the time that we have shared with you, and will forever watch over your family.
Fort Dodge, Iowa. October 2nd, 2019. Police lights paint the front of St. Paul Lutheran Church in red and blue. Paramedics work frantically over a man lying motionless on the ground, the beloved pastor who had led this congregation for 2 decades. Just minutes earlier, he had been greeting students arriving for confirmation class. Now, he was fighting for his life. Witnesses say a stranger had tried to force his way in through a back door. Moments later, the pastor was down, and the suspect had vanished into the streets. Within hours, police would have a man in custody, but the motive? That would turn out to be far darker, and far more complicated, than anyone could have imagined. It was a crisp Wednesday afternoon in Fort Dodge. Inside St. Paul Lutheran Church, the sounds of chatter and footsteps filled the hall as middle schoolers arrived for confirmation class. Outside, the sky was calm, but in the span of seconds, peace would give way to chaos. At the rear of the building, a man approached a locked exit that led to the fellowship hall and kitchen. This wasn't a public entrance, and his presence there drew immediate concern. Reverend Allen Henderson, 64 years old, walked toward him. Those who knew Henderson would say it was in his nature to meet any stranger with a warm word, but on this day, his steps carried purpose. He was protecting the children inside. What happened next is only partly known from eyewitness accounts. A confrontation erupted, brief, intense, and violent. Henderson was struck, collapsing just outside the church doors. By the time police arrived, the man responsible was gone. Officers fanned out through the neighborhood, searching. And inside the church, the congregation began to realize that something terrible had just happened to the man who had been the heart of their community for 20 years. To understand the weight of this loss, you have to know who Reverend Allen Henderson was, not just the man in the collar, but the man behind it. Allen was 64 years old, but carried himself with the energy of someone half his age. For 2 decades, he had served as the pastor of St. Paul Lutheran Church. His congregation didn't just see him as a preacher, he was a mentor, a neighbor, a friend who seemed to have an endless supply of compassion. Before his years at St. Paul, Henderson had served as a military chaplain, standing beside service members through deployments, losses, and homecomings. That dedication to service didn't end when he returned home. He became a volunteer chaplain for the local police and fire departments, showing up at accident scenes, crime scenes, or house fires, offering quiet comfort when the rest of the world had gone chaotic. It wasn't unusual to see him in his clergy shirt and collar, standing with first responders in the cold or the rain. He was the man who would say the prayer before a big football game, the one who'd quietly check on a widow months after the funeral, the one who knew the names of the kids in his youth group, and remembered their birthdays. Outside of his duties, Henderson loved the simple things. Spending time with his wife and family. Sharing coffee with friends at a local diner. Volunteering for youth programs. He had a laugh that could carry across a crowded hall, and a patience that made people feel safe to open up to him. For Fort Dodge, Allen Henderson wasn't just a pastor. He was the steady, reassuring voice in the middle of life's storms. Which is why, when news broke that he had been attacked at his own church, it felt like the ground shifted beneath this community. Just blocks away from St. Paul Lutheran Church lived a man whose name most of the congregation had never heard, Joshua Pendleton. In his mid-30s, Pendleton was known in the neighborhood, though not for church attendance or community events. People who crossed paths with him sometimes described erratic behavior, sudden mood changes, and moments where he seemed disconnected from reality. Pendleton had a documented history of mental illness. Later, in court, his defense team would reveal he had been diagnosed with schizophrenia, a serious condition that can distort thinking, perception, and judgment. In the days leading up to October 2nd, those close to him said his thinking had become increasingly paranoid. In his mind, dark and irrational fears were starting to take root. Pendleton convinced himself that something dangerous, something terrible, was happening inside St. Paul Lutheran Church. And on that Wednesday afternoon, he decided to act on those beliefs. The lines between reality and delusion had blurred for him. But for everyone else, what happened next would be all too real. It was late afternoon on October 2nd, 2019. Inside St. Paul Lutheran Church, the air buzzed with the sound of middle schoolers gathering for confirmation class, the kind of weekly ritual that had taken place here for generations. Parents were dropping off kids, volunteers were setting up, and the building felt safe, as it always did. At the rear of the church, away from the main entrance, a door led into the fellowship hall and kitchen. This was not a public access point, it was used by staff, volunteers, and sometimes for events. It's here that Joshua Pendleton appeared. Witnesses later recalled that he didn't walk up like someone attending a class or a service. He moved with urgency, almost pushing toward the door. His presence was unexpected, and in a building filled with children, unexpected could mean unsafe. Reverend Henderson noticed. At 64, he could have easily waved someone else over to handle it. But that wasn't his way. He stepped outside, approaching Pendleton directly. What he didn't know was that Pendleton had already built a dangerous story in his mind, a false belief that a child inside was in danger, and that he was the one who needed to stop it.
Sinking in.
He was so community-minded. He, like they said, he was selfless. He gave of himself, and his family gave too.
It's hard to put into words, but it's a big loss. He had an impact in everything that seemed to be going on.
It's going to be very difficult. I know it's going to take some time. We will just miss him.
The two men stood face to face. The students inside, just steps away, had no idea that a confrontation was about to erupt on the other side of the door. The exchange between Reverend Allen Henderson and Joshua Pendleton started with words, but within moments, it escalated into violence. Pendleton lunged. What happened in those seconds was brutal and sudden. Witnesses later described a struggle just outside the church doors. Henderson, a man who had spent his life calming storms for others, was now caught in one he couldn't stop. The blows left him gravely injured. He collapsed on the ground near the rear entrance, his body still, the quiet fall air broken only by the sound of footsteps fading as Pendleton fled the scene. Inside, the children and volunteers remained unaware of the danger that had unfolded only feet away. Outside, someone ran to call 911. When first responders arrived, they found the pastor unresponsive, his injuries consistent with a violent assault. Medics worked desperately, loading him into an ambulance and rushing him to the hospital. But just after arrival, the man who had been the spiritual heartbeat of Fort Dodge was pronounced dead. With a suspect on the run and a beloved pastor lying dead, Fort Dodge police moved quickly. Witness accounts pointed them toward the surrounding neighborhood, just a short distance from the church. It didn't take long. Within hours, officers spotted a man matching the description, Joshua Pendleton. He was taken into custody without a struggle, only blocks from where the attack had happened. At the station, investigators worked to piece together what had unfolded. Alongside the murder charge, they added a count of first-degree robbery, alleging Pendleton had taken items from Henderson during the assault. News of the arrest spread through the city. For the congregation of St. Paul Lutheran, the relief of knowing the suspect was caught did little to ease the shock of losing the man who had led them for 20 years. And for the prosecutor's office, the real work was just beginning, to prove, beyond a reasonable doubt, exactly what happened that day and why. The trial didn't take place in Webster County, where the crime happened. The case had drawn so much attention in Fort Dodge that a judge ordered it moved to Scott County to ensure a fair jury could be found. From the start, the defense made their strategy clear. They would argue that Joshua Pendleton was legally insane at the time of the killing. His attorneys told the court that Pendleton suffered from schizophrenia, and that on October 2nd, he believed he was saving a child from harm inside the church. The prosecution countered with a simpler argument. Regardless of his mental health struggles, Pendleton knew what he was doing when he attacked Reverend Henderson. They pointed to his actions before and after the assault, the witnesses who saw him at the rear door, and his decision to flee afterward as signs of awareness. Witnesses took the stand, neighbors, church members, police officers, each filling in pieces of that violent afternoon. The jury heard about the confrontation, the injuries, and the life Reverend Henderson had led before it was cut short. Over days of testimony, one question hung in the air: was this the act of a man fully responsible for his choices, or of someone whose mind had lost its grasp on reality? After days of testimony and hours of deliberation, the jury returned to the courtroom. On April 27, 2021, they delivered their verdict: guilty of first-degree murder and first-degree robbery. The words carried a finality that rippled through the room. For Reverend Henderson's family and congregation, it was the justice they had been waiting for, though no sentence could bring back the man they loved. The punishment was mandatory under Iowa law: life in prison without the possibility of parole for the murder conviction, plus an additional 25 years for the robbery charge, to be served at the same time. In the moments after sentencing, family members spoke about Henderson's unwavering service to his community, his faith, and his kindness. Some found comfort in knowing the man responsible would never walk free again. Others could only sit quietly, still absorbing the reality of what had happened. In the weeks after the trial, St. Paul Lutheran Church became more than a place of worship. It became a gathering point for grief, remembrance, and resilience. Members of the congregation organized memorial services, placing flowers outside the church doors where Henderson had last stood. His photo, framed in black cloth, rested near the altar for months. The stories poured in, from first responders who remembered him standing beside them at the worst moments of their careers, from parents whose children he had mentored, from neighbors who recalled his quiet kindness in everyday life. Even in death, Henderson's influence didn't fade. The church expanded its outreach programs in his name, continuing the work he loved most: caring for others without hesitation. For Fort Dodge, the law still lingers, a reminder of how fragile safety can feel, even in sacred places. Reverend Allen Henderson's life was defined by service. His final act, confronting a threat to protect those inside, was in keeping with everything he stood for. And though one man's violence ended his life, it couldn't erase the decades he spent lifting others up. His legacy remains, not in the tragedy of his death, but in the countless lives he touched while he lived.